why don't we, is there any one we want to start with that we think is maybe the most obvious?
I think that whale is the most obvious for
Or which flux?
convection.
I would agree. So why don't we put that there for now? And then maybe let's start at the top. Like, what do we think's going on in this picture? We have some sort of ungulate sitting in what looks to be mud water. So maybe that, let's not completely write convection off because there's some water up here. But is there maybe a better explanation?
Evaporation.
Why?
I mean, just because he's moist.
Because the liquid, but it's evaporating off of him, cooling him down.
Yeah, I think that's a good argument. What about it? Is there any argument for conduction? Like, is there contact with this organism in another body?
Maybe the mud, if it was solid enough, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, you can make the argument, right, that it's touching the ground, and you can definitely pass, energy via conduction by laying on the ground. It's heads up, so it could have more of its body on the ground, so it's not, it's not completely sprawled out as wide as it can be. And then what, convection, we said water, so that's a possibility. There's a little bit of evidence, radiation. What's some evidence of radiation in this picture?
Daylight.
Yep, it's daylight, so it means the sun's out, so the sun radiation is flowing. And we can kind of, I know this goes a little bit beyond cog books, but being an upper level class, like we have some background. When do animals typically lay in water? Like under what environmental conditions?
During the day when it's hot.
Yeah, I would argue more so when they're warm, animals try to lose heat to like mud, right? So there's some evidence that it's warm here. So that being thought, how does the animal being warm relate to solar radiation absorption? Do you think it's going to absorb a lot of solar radiation or maybe start reflecting some solar radiation?
Were you asking because it's covered in mud?
Yeah, that would be a second clue for sure, that for reflection. So remember, radiation's energy flow. If you have a high amount of energy, so if you're hot, your body has a lot of extra energy in it and you're trying to dump it, via radiation. So you're not likely going to absorb a ton of energy. So it's energy in, energy out, right? So in the mud is, I think, a great point, right? That's covering some of the surface area. So that area is going to be reflected. So it's not going to absorb a lot of radiation. And mud actually acts as an insulator. So it might keep some of the radiation of the animal in as well. So it's going to be a twofold. It's not going to radiate out as much and it won't absorb as much radiation. So we can kind of just think through these. I think we did some good argument, and I would agree evaporation in this one is likely the case. They're getting wet in the mud to try and, because what happens to energy during evaporation? Maybe let's just finish our argument for evaporation. Does an animal lose energy via evaporation or gain energy?
He loses energy.
Yeah, and we made the argument, it's logical that this animal is warm, so it's likely going to be evaporating a lot of water to lose energy. So I would agree with evaporation here. What about this owl? Based on process of elimination, we've got radiation and conduction left. And then we have another picture of this bird. I mean, I think these two are the most difficult.
Yeah, I would say conduction, because like you said, by process of elimination, when you look at the little bird in the bottom left, it's only got, a foot on the branch. So it's more than likely going to be radiation for him because he's not making contact with, it doesn't have that much surface area on anything else.
I think that's a good argument, right? Can we make any second arguments about some evidence in this picture? Like what else do we see? We see a bird on a branch. What about the background? Kind of like we talked about up here. Do we think this bird is in a warm environment, a cold environment?
Looks like it's a cold environment.
Yeah, I think this is weaker evidence because it's blurry, but to me, I would argue that might be their birds outside in winter, right? And if you're in a cold environment, are you likely, you might then be very different from that environmental temperature. So you might be losing a lot of your body heat via radiation, especially, a bird being an endotherm. What about the owl? Let's make some arguments for conduction and against maybe radiation then, just to make sure we're going in the right direction with all of these.
He's just really all up on the ground. He's got a lot of surface area touching the ground.
And that favors which one?
Conduction.
Yeah, I think that's a great argument, right? It looks like it, it might have definitely more surface area than this animal, right? So I would agree. What about as far as radiation? If we think about surface area of exposure to maybe the sun. Does the owl have a lot or a little bit of its body exposed?
It's hard to gain perspective from this, but it looks like just a little bit.
That's a very fair point. Yeah, I mean, we can only see its head. We don't know really what the back looks like, but at least the front here is possibly being blocked by the sun. And if we think about it in a comparative sense, this bird's very exposed, right? So it could gain a lot of radiation possibly from the sun as well. So I agree that we would say radiation for this one and conduction for this one. And check ourselves. Yeah, and those are correct. Yeah, so it seems, just go through, if you're not sure, just go through a process of elimination and make sure you have an argument for each one. And I think that will kind of lead us to the correct answer on the exams, because you will see these, types of pictures on the exam. Most likely, have one or two pictures and have a true or false or a multiple choice question about which type of heat flux you have. All right. I think that's pretty good. When we check out number 3, so this one says, relate structure, postures, or behaviors of organisms to the variables in the equations that define heat flux. So this one is, again, being able to see the equation. You won't have to draw the equations from memory, as we talked about before, but if you see the equation of radiation, you might have to, say like, what variable represents surface area? Does this one involve ambient temperature? Does this involve ground temperature? Why is surface area important for, a certain heat flux such as conduction, right? If you have a high amount of surface area touching another surface area, that's a lot of physical contact, so high levels of conduction. If you have very little surface area contacting each other, that's low levels of conduction. So it's going to be those types of questions. These might be related to the pictures too, where you're given a picture and a list of equations and it go, what's being, most represented in this picture. So you have to know what the 4 possible equations represent, which one's radiation, which one's convection, which one's evaporation. And same, basically going to be like matching or multiple choice again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but as far as in the equations, will it say like Q rad emitted like it does in the equations in
It'll probably like, let me go to my notes real quick and find the equations, and then I'll share my, I think
because that would obviously make the questions much easier, but
yeah, so, okay, I think I know what you're asking now. Let me quick share my screen. All right, so like this is the conduction equation. So you say Q sub conduct equals this, right? Likely what you're going to get on the exam is just the right half after the equal sign. So you're going to have, you don't have to write this out, but it might go, you have this equation, you have this equation, which one is conduction?
Okay, so basically just like the activities that we did in Cogbooks.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to look at it. They try to mirror those activities on the exam so that you've had actual practice doing this type of work. good to go to the next question or?
Yes.
Okay. Back to the list. Okay, so this one says contrast strategies that freshwater animals and saltwater animals use to osmoregulate. So this one, you could kind of maybe break down, and this might not be bad to kind of make notes first and like flesh them out. Like we think about osmoregulate, what kind of things do you think of? Maybe what kind of processes? Maybe I'll get it started and say it involves solvents typically, right?
Yeah, I'm here. Is regulating like water and salt.
Yeah, right. And how do we typically pass water? How do animals pass water and salts in and out of their body? And we're talking about aquatic. So we have saltwater, say saltwater fish and freshwater fish for sake of argument here, because this is asking about saltwater and freshwater animals.
Yeah, so usually in through the mouth and then out through gills and urine.
Yep. Yeah. So those are pathways, right? What type of pathways are involved? We have different types of transport, right? There's two main ones.
So you have the active transport and passive transport.
Yep. Yeah. So those things, and then we have water transport right through osmosis would be another one. But yes, so those types of things. Now we can relate. You know, you're gonna have to describe, say, a freshwater fish, and then describe it for a saltwater fish. And how are so it's saying here to contrast the strategy. So how are they different, right? So if you have a freshwater fish and fresh water, maybe let's just think of the pathway of salt. Is salt going to be high in the fish or high in the water when you have a freshwater fish and fresh water?
The salt's going to be higher in the fish than it
Right.
would
So
be.
what direction is it going to go? Is it going to try to get more salt in the fish, or is the fish going to try and lose salt?
He's going to try to lose the salt by peeing a lot.
Yeah, right. Because it wants to go to equilibrium, right? This is kind of basic chemistry where there's goes from high levels to low levels until it equilibrates and then the flow kind of stops. And the saltwater fish then would probably be the opposite, right? Where it's going to be surrounded by salt, so it's going to be trying to absorb more water. So I guess maybe somebody want to take a stab at contrasting the strategies now. So we listed some like just general strategies. Now we have to assign which go to which organism and how they use these.
Like, do you mean just, that the freshwater fish is going to be drinking a lot drinking not a lot and peeing a lot? And then the saltwater fish is going to be drinking a lot and not peeing very much?
Yeah, and then one of the strategies a saltwater fish can do too is it can have concentrated pee where it can reabsorb some of its water through its kidneys, right, to kind of maintain that water in its system.
Right, like the sharks retaining some of that urea.
Yeah, they have different types of waste, so that would be a way to contrast it. Do they pee the same materials, right? Sharks pee more; they have the urea system. Yeah, so the way I would address this one is, break it apart, think about which direction they're flowing, which is the opposite. So that really helps with the contrast here with freshwater and saltwater. And then, how do they use passive transport to force solutes against its concentration gradient? And how do they use active transport to allow solutes to go down its concentration gradient? And this is something I'm not overly familiar with in my background, so I would need to study this. So if we don't know this as a group in detail right now, there's a couple pages in Cogbooks that maybe I recommend reviewing. But I think this is a good way to think about it and kind of gets it started. You guys have any specific questions about the different mechanisms?
Oh, well, we need to remember the balanced equation for like carbonic acid releasing hydrogen ions and things.
That, because that's not this section, right? That's a little bit.
That's the diffusion of the gases, the metabolism of aquatic organisms.
No, you're not going to need to know the basic chemistry, like the chemical structures of that kind of stuff. It would be helpful, like if they're different and you just like spell out bicarbonate acid, say like one makes this and one makes that, like urea or something. It would be helpful in your explanation, but there's not going to be like multiple choice questions like which one is bicarbonate on this exam or anything like that. Any other questions about this question, or feel like good to move on, or?
I'm okay to move on.
Okay. Yeah, and this one, like Cogbooks, I could read like, what Cogbook says to you. I just don't know that that would be very helpful because there's specific pages for this that, I think it'd just be good to review because they lay out the processes and the pathways pretty well. And I think we hit most of the key points. We brought up some of the examples of like the sharks, so we know that they're different. So, okay. So if we go to number 5, that says describe the challenge that aquatic plants face when acquiring carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So this one, I think this might have been what you're getting at. This one is more concerned with the gas exchanges. It's like talking about a big, one of the most important gases here is CO2, and oxygen is another big one. Those are what plants are exchanging with their environment. So knowing the directions again that they go in, how they take CO2 up when it's in salt water here, because this is aquatic, or this is no, this is not, well, it could be salt water, but it's not specific to that. This is aquatic plants.
I just thought it was neat that the mangrove uses active transport to secrete the salt through its leaves. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, no, that's a great, that's could be part of this, that's one of the challenges it faces, right? Because what's a requirement of active transport?
That it's going against the concentration gradient.
Yep, and what does it require to go against this concentration gradient? Is that an easy process? Does it cost the animal anything?
ATP.
Yeah, exactly. And ATP is a form of energy, right? So it requires energy to do that. So there is a cost, which would be a challenge that some aquatic plants face with gas exchange. So that's a great example. I guess maybe something else to think about is what happens when and how CO2 dissolves in water. So you brought up, I believe, right, something like one of the acids, so carbonic acid, that's involved in the conversion of CO2 dissolving into water. So knowing some of those details, not necessarily the chemistry, but just the process of what happens is going to be important. It's like how CO2 is dissolved and how CO2 remains in water and how CO2 is taken up by the plants. All right, why don't we go on to maybe number 6 then? And that one says, explain how countercurrent blood flow enhances the diffusion of oxygen in the gills of aquatic animals. So first, why don't we maybe describe what countercurrent exchange is? So this is countercurrent gas exchange.
It's when two gases are moving in opposite directions on either side of a barrier.
Yeah, and in an animal, what are typically those barriers?
The blood, capillaries,
Yep, no,
gills.
exactly correct, right? You have capillaries that maybe run against each other, run against the water. So you could have blood flow against water. You have different levels of oxygen in different capillaries. You have different levels of oxygen in the water than you do in your blood. And this is the gas exchange across such barriers, as you said. So explain how, the question is how countercurrent blood flow enhances the diffusion of oxygen in the gills. So how does countercurrent blood flow gain oxygen in the gills of, like, say, a fish, an aquatic animal? Is oxygen typically higher in the water, or is it going to be higher in the blood? Say in a good aquatic environment. Well, where is the animal getting the oxygen from? Let's back up a step.
He's getting it from the water.
Right, yeah, so it's trying, so there must be oxygen available in the water that the fish is trying to get. So in the blood flow in the opposite directions, right, the concentration of oxygen in the water could exceed the concentration in the blood throughout most of the region of contact. So therefore, if we think about concentration gradients from high to low, this would cause the oxygen to flow into the blood, which then is taken into the animal. So this is along the lines of gaining oxygen. So
Right. So it's gaining the oxygen and then secreting the water through its urine and gills, right? Or no, just through urine.
Well, this isn't necessarily about waste. So I think you're thinking too far down the system. The countercurrent, where you talked about, right, is the flow in opposite directions. And this is the capillaries of the gills. So if we flow in opposite direction, according to this, that's going to help absorb oxygen. So this is a way, countercurrent, if you think about it, it's enhancing diffusion of oxygen.
I guess I don't really understand what is moving. What are the two opposing fluids or gases? Like, is it oxygen and water that are moving countercurrent to each other? Or I don't really understand. I don't really understand the countercurrent circulation.
Fair enough. Why don't we try and find this maybe in cogbooks? I think visuals can be maybe a little helpful. So this is all right. I'm gonna share my screen. All right. So this is the section that it's referring to. So we have blood flow going one direction. I can make this bigger. Yeah. So this is when it does not occur. So the blood flow and the water flow. So I think your question was, is it concerning blood and water, right? So that's the two flows. So now in countercurrent, we have blood flow going in one direction and water going in another direction. And then here, these numbers are showing us the concentrations of oxygen. So red indicates that blood is, high levels of concentration. And I think blue is going to be low levels of oxygen. So the fact that the numbers differ is going to, when the blood flows, these numbers are lower right here, right, than the ones below it. So if there's higher concentrations of oxygen in the water due to the flow, it's going to come into the gills. So the fact that these numbers are lower and these numbers are higher is going to tell us the direction of blood flow. Versus up here, if it's going the same direction, you get some absorption here, but then eventually it equilibrates going in the same direction. So there's no longer going to be uptake here, where right here, because it's the opposite, you're going to have uptake throughout the entire process.
All right, I think I got that.
Okay, are there any other questions about that or concerns? Move to the question 7. So this one says, given relationship between a phenotype and fitness, identify the mode of selection. So it would be like directional selection, stabilizing selection, or disruptive, right? Why don't we just go to one of the activities real quick? I think kind of visualizing this might also be helpful. Let me share my screen again real quick. All right. All right, so these are the types of figures that this question is going to be associated with, where again, you have some type of phenotypic value on the x-axis and relative fitness, and then these are your values. And then if selection is being enabled here, there's different types. So what kind of pattern do we see in this top left box?
That's a directional negative directional.
Okay.
Yeah, right, because the trend would be negative going down, right? And it's directional, like as you said. So negative directional there. What about this one up here?
That's a positive directional.
Yep, because it's a positive trend line through those points. And what about this one here when it's like a kind of like almost like a bell curve?
Stabilizing.
What's the argument that this would be stabilizing?
Because the ends are kind of not as fit as the middle.
Yeah, I think that's the start of the argument, right? Because you have phenotypes with the extreme values, right? So here and here, high and low, those have pretty much the lowest fitness, and the middle one, so the moderate phenotype value, has the highest fitness. So that would be like kind of a stabilizing towards the middle. Then what about the last one? Why is this disruptive?
Because the intermediate phenotypes are the ones that are the most fit. I mean, the extreme phenotypes or the intermediate phenotypes are the least fit. Exactly. So you're getting them spread out in either direction.
Yeah, it's disrupting like the middle, right? And it's causing them to diverge to different extreme phenotypes. Yeah, very good. We'll submit that. It'll tell us that, yeah, we did that. And there's more activities like that. I think you seem to have a pretty good, handle on it. We explained why each one is which. Any more questions on here? Feel good to go to the next question.
I'm good on that.
Okay,
Same.
cool. So then number 8 says, given a relationship between a phenotype and fitness, identify the optimal phenotype. So this again is going to involve similar figures. Go. Maybe walk through one of these examples too, just to make sure we understand the why part. Okay, so again, we have some level of phenotypic value. The numerical values don't matter. It's just important to know that they're increasing from left to right. And this is a high phenotypic value, obviously, and a low phenotypic value. Relative fitness on the y-axis. Again, in A, where do we have the highest, like what is the associated phenotypic value with the highest relative fitness, given these choices?
0-ish.
Yeah, so to the far left. So for now, we could say, 0 is probably the most likely answer. What about in B?
So greater than 19.
Yeah, so it's 19 is the most extreme end. So, this is likely the answer. I would agree. Now, what about something here? We have stabilizing selection. Where's the highest phenotypic value?
Looks like the 22.
Yeah, so somewhere in the middle. So somewhere in this range, a little bit right of 20. 22 seems pretty reasonable. Now, what about D, where it's highest on both sides? But the data we're given is what we have to use.
Greater than 50.
Yeah, right, because it's pretty high over here, but these are the highest points. That's the extreme. Yeah, so seems like those should be pretty straightforward. So I make sure we're able to walk through them with explanation. So we're good on.
Would it have been possible for that last one for like the answer to have been greater than 50 or below whatever that low one was, or would we just be looking for the very highest, like in a disruptive graph like that?
So
Like,
that it could be greater than 50, or what was your other?
or 0, like could it be?
I mean, you could
just either.
I wouldn't be either, because this one's, it's asking what is, what's phenotypic value gives the greatest relative fitness. So like this point, I would argue is maybe the third or fourth highest point. So this technically does, from the data we have, has
Right.
greater fitness over here than this. So if you said it would be 0, would be technically, I would in this instance be wrong, right?
Yeah.
You could make an argument verbally that say either a very low phenotypic value or a high phenotypic value will give you the greatest general relative fitness, but this is going to be, a better answer, I would say, than this answer.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, well, good question. All right, so number 9 says, describe natural selection, genetic drift, migration, and mutation, or describe how these natural selection, genetic drift, migration, and mutation contribute to the evolution of a population. So why don't we maybe just kind of break them down and talk about what is natural selection first?
It's deciding which traits get passed down by most fit, which ones are the most fit.
I think you're definitely going down the right path. So you can think of it as it's like a processing, right? It's a mode of evolution. So it'll work towards selecting genes that enhance fitness, right? And they'll select genes that or select against genes that inhibit fitness or reduce fitness.
Right. Yeah. that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, like I said, you're definitely on the right path. What about genetic drift?
It's when, especially in a small population, the genes just kind of disappear just randomly.
Yeah,
Right.
this often involves like chance events, right? So what would be
Right.
an example of a chance event that could shift, like that could affect a small population?
I don't, maybe just like a sudden cold front in an area that doesn't usually have them. So
Yeah,
like
okay,
plants.
that could definitely work. So okay, let's run with that. You have a cold front that happens with plants in a certain region. What does that cold front do to the plants?
If it just, you know, kills them all or
Well,
stops them from reproducing.
does it kill them all?
No,
Um,
no, some of those are going to adapt to that cold front.
So yeah, so again, you're definitely on the right path. What I would argue is that you would kill, like say maybe 90-95% of those plants. So then you have a very small fraction of those plants that survive, and then they repopulate. But that repopulation is due to that limited gene pool. So like whatever those genes that 5% of those survivors had, that's going to become very prevalent in the rest of the population. Another common example is birds getting blown to an island from the mainland, right? So you have a small fraction of these birds that maybe get caught in a storm, get blown to an island, and then they're isolated on this island and they repopulate that island. But it's by chance their genetic makeup is what it is there because though very few genes were selected from the main population. And then natural selection is likely going to act on them and they might diverge. And as we mentioned before, someone said adapt to that new environment that they happened on by chance. What about migration? Let's talk about that a little bit. What does that do to the genetics of a population?
Reduces the variation.
How so?
I would have said that it increases variation because you're getting individuals from other areas coming in and mixing with the local population.
So you could argue that, right, it brings new phenotypes and genotypes from one population to another. And that would make it could make an entire population more, it could make the entire population more homogeneous. So I guess at a small scale, it introduces variety, but if you think about it at a population level, it could reduce variety. Does that make sense?
Exactly. That's what I was thinking, because the more that you have of different phenotypes together, then they're going to interbreed. And then eventually, the differentiations and alleles and stuff are going to get bred out. They'll become more similar.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the last one is mutation. What is that? How is that related to genes?
It's just random events happening that may continue on or may just die out. But it could add variation if the if it ends up being fit for the area, the mutations could end up just being selected for.
What does it do to the gene?
Changes it.
Yeah, so it's a random gene, right?
Yeah.
And as you said, if it enhances fitness, selection will probably act on it to keep it. If it inhibits fitness, selection will act on it, likely to remove it from the population. All right, so then I guess the big meat of the question is, how do these different processes contribute to the evolution of a population? We kind of talked about that with each one. And if we think back to previous questions, if we go back to the first one, natural selection, right? So that could be directional selection, right? So it could change, the evolutionary trajectory of a population given its abiotic and biotic environments and how it relates to fitness. Genetic drift can maybe be thought of as like a resetting of the genes from a small subsample being placed somewhere else, and then it grows from that smaller sample. And if you pull different subsamples, say you have a big population of birds, and you pull 5% of each and you put them on different islands, right? Those genes and those different populations might be different, so you might get different evolutionary trajectories to some extent of those different populations due to the random chance event that caused the genetic drift. Would you say that migration could speed up or maybe slow down evolutionary changes in a population?
I think you could argue both, because if they're, populations migrating to an area, then they're going to breed and changes are going to become more rapid. And then if they're migrating away, then you have smaller populations.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the answer is kind of, it starts with, it depends. And then you bring up, different arguments. You could argue it either way. All right, I think we covered those pretty well. Does does the group have any questions about those 4 different like processes?
I'm good.
Okay. Anyone else or good?
I'm good too.
So then number 10 says, given information about the environmental conditions and the mean phenotype of populations, determine whether phenotypes resulted from natural selection or genetic drift. So again, I think this is going to depend on, the information provided. But we can look at, if we think back to some of those figures, if we look at the shape of them, I think that's going to be telling if what the mean phenotype, if it evolved from genetic drift or evolved from natural selection, depending if it was predictable. So if it's directional per se, like it's going up constantly, you could say, that's likely pushing the mean phenotype by selection. If it's more random, it would be more along the lines of genetic drift. Does anybody have anything, a question about that or something you want to add to it?
So it makes sense to me.
Okay. We could move on to number 11. So this one says, describe the phenotypes that constitute an organism's life history. I guess maybe here, if we kind of think about what does life history mean, what are some life history traits that Cogbooks went over?
Like the reproduction and the survival, like how the longevity.
Yeah, longevity or lifespan. That's a good example. And then you're talking about reproduction. That's definitely on the right track.
Fecundity.
Yeah, so the number of offspring produced, maybe the number of reproductive events. We think about size at sexual maturity, age at sexual maturity, the size of the offspring. Do they have few large offspring? Do they have many small offspring? The level of parental care, right? The more parental care they have, the more energy they have to invest into each individual organism. And species have different life history traits, where you have maybe a spider gives birth to 200 individuals and they take off right after they hatch, versus birds have maybe 4 to 8 individuals, depending on the species, and the parents feed them for a certain period of time during their life. So there's different levels of parental care.
They're affected too by the amount of resources they have, the predators, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's basically, we listed off different life history traits, and just saying describe phenotypes that constitute an organism. So those are most of the examples that I could think of, unless anybody else has more examples they want to add to the list. All right, and then if not, we can go on, because I think these next ones kind of relate back to this life history traits a little bit. So number 12 says, use the principle of allocation to explain trade-offs between phenotypes that constitute an organism's life history. So this one is maybe, list off some examples. We talk about, let me let's back up. I can talk about the principle of allocation. So what is that getting at?
It's saying that you can only, if you have limited resources, you can only allocate those to like one behavior or function at a time.
Yeah, I would agree. Can you maybe give an example of that?
So like, I think they used like the size of the womb can kind of limit whether you have, you can, if you, the size of the womb is going to say that you can either have many small babies or, one large baby. So you'd be giving up the number of offspring as a trade-off with the size of the offspring.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think another example they listed was lifespan, right? So if you have a longer lifespan, you can theoretically mature, become sexually mature later at a larger body size, which would make you, potentially less vulnerable to predators, or maybe even more attractive to mates, because body size is also a phenotype that is attractive to mates. You might be a stronger competitor if you're bigger. And you can also then, related to what you're saying, if you're larger at sexual maturity, you're a bigger body size, you have maybe a bigger womb, you can potentially have larger offspring or more offspring. So then there's probably 50 things we could list here. So the key is just to think about the trade-offs. If what are the different life history traits, and if you invest heavily in one because you have limited resources, how does that limit your investments in the others? All right, any other questions on number 12? If not, why don't we go ahead and go to 13? 13 says, list the phenotypes that characterize organisms at each end of the slow and fast continuum of life histories. So why don't we maybe break this down again and talk about each one individually? It's like, what is the slow continuum of life history referring to? Do we tend to think of large animals here, or maybe small animals here on the slow end?
I think the larger animals on the slow end, because it takes them longer to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some of the examples they gave here were like elephants, albatross, giant tortoises, oak trees. So you said it takes them a long time to grow. What are their, how else would we describe the slow end of the spectrum of these organisms?
And then they reproduce later in life.
Yeah, so a long time to reach sexual maturity. If you grow for a long time and you reach sexual maturity late in life, what does that kind of say about your lifespan?
You have a longer lifespan.
Yeah, so these tend to have longer lifespan. What about number of offspring? Do they have many or do they have few?
I think a few, right?
Yep, they have low number of offspring. And when you have low number of offspring, what does that typically associate, parental investment levels, high or low?
Higher investment.
Yeah, because you have less offspring to look after. So the odds of them dying is probably higher if you don't help them or protect them or feed them. So you tend to have high parental investment. And then if we switch over to the fast end, that's going to be the opposite. So maybe we just quickly state, what type of animals are good examples of the fast end of the spectrum?
Insects.
Yeah, like fruit
flies and stuff. Yeah.
Weedy plants tend to be a good one. So they're quick growing. They sexually mature very quickly again. They tend to have, high levels of offspring. So fruit flies lay a ton of eggs. And do fruit flies take care of their offspring?
No.
Yeah, so then they have low levels of parental investment. I think that's a lot of information that, talking about the different phenotypes that characterize these organisms. So I think we answered 13 pretty well. Does anybody have any questions or anything to add?
No.
Okay, so I want to go to 14, where it says, predict how environmental conditions will affect patterns of growth and reproduction. For this one, there's quite a bit of information that we can discuss. So what are some environmental conditions that we can think of? Just maybe just list them quick, like that affects patterns of growth and reproduction.
Is this like where the Philip Grimes competitors and tolerators and ruderols, whatever, where that kind of stuff fits in?
Yeah, I mean, there's competitors in the environment, right? So that could be like some biotic factors that affect growth and reproduction.
And then the abiotic stress.
You're talking about like amount of resources.
Yeah, so resources directly affect life histories, right? How so? I guess maybe I agree, but can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, higher amount of food. You're probably going to have a higher mass and more likely to survive.
Yeah, so they could affect, if there's a lot of resources available, they can eat a lot, so they might evolve to be a larger body size. If there's not very many resources available, it might be the opposite, right? So here I would think forwards and backwards, like what if they have a lot and what if they have a little? Like how does it affect that life history trait? What about, they gave some examples, I think, of predators, right? How does predation affect life history traits?
Yes, it was like the time and the size of hatchings. So the longer something's in an egg, the more likely it's going to be vulnerable to predators.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think that was the frog metamorphosis example, right? So it can affect, like you said, the timing, the duration, maybe even the size, right? If larger eggs survive, because this maybe a snake can't fit them in their mouth, then it's going to select for larger offspring. And maybe if predators don't like a ton of little eggs because it's a lot of work to get nutrition, maybe it'll evolve and life history traits will shift to smaller egg size. Yeah, so again, this is one that, there's many examples in cog books. We listed off a couple good ones, and just to kind of think through how different things from the environment, anything where you said resources, predators, competitors, abiotic conditions, such as, in temperature, those can all affect, patterns of growth and reproduction. We covered that one pretty well. All right, so what about 15? Given a relationship between an offspring's energy and its survival, predict the optimal amount of energy that a parent should invest in each offspring. So I think we kind of covered this when we went through some of the activities earlier. Do you want to, yeah, so this is the one. Let me share my screen real quick just to make sure we're all on the same page. So this again is this kind of going to be this kind of chart where you're going to be given a scenario. So assuming that a female invests X amount of energy. So again, in this case, it was what, 1,000 kilojoules. And you have your kilojoules here and your survivorship here. Remember, we're finding like kind of the tangent line will be the optimal point. And then it could ask, let me go to the next. Is that the last one? Okay, so we did cover all these activities. Did we want to review this a little bit more, or do we think we understood this pretty well from before?
I understood it pretty well.
Okay, so then I think we need to spend a bunch more time if we don't have more questions on it. So we kind of worked ahead. All right, and that brings us to the last question. So that says, given the energy available for reproduction, use a model to predict the optimal number of offspring. So that's going to be, again, the exact same thing that we just talked about, but a little bit in reverse. So the question that we reviewed was, given this much energy, how many offspring should we produce? And then they might switch it, the math a little bit. And by a model, it's the same figures. I don't understand, honestly, why they changed the wording there, but it might ask, like, given this number of offspring, how much energy would be required, at minimum to produce these offspring? So it's kind of just a flip of the same question. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I mean that covers all of the review topics from that list. So I appreciate the people that are here for their input and participation. I think that'll be beneficial again to anybody that watches this video. So thank you for that. Does the group here have any additional questions or topics they want to talk about?
No, I thought that was a great review. I appreciate it.
Good, no problem.
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Okay, we can end it there. Again, thanks for joining and participating.
Thank you.
Talk to the group later.
Bye.
You have a good day.
Yep.